Christianity Today's well-known podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, is back in the news yet again. And this time, we are going to be talking about it. Stay tuned. Well, good evening and welcome back to another week of Explain, another week where we engage the culture from a biblical perspective in a manner which glorifies God. My name is Troy and I am your host. Thank you for taking some time out of your night to join us here yet again. This episode, I will make no bones about it. This episode is one that I have wanted to do for a long time. And I think I've probably forgotten about it several times. The fact that The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, which is a podcast put out by Christianity Today, is back in the news yet again, kind of served as a little reminder for me to get on it. Okay, so that is what I am doing. I am getting on it. I am taking some time this week to respond to that podcast and tell you what I think about it. So this is a podcast that went mega viral. Everybody was listening to it and everybody was trying to figure out what it was that went on. It was a podcast basically chronicling the I guess rise and fall of a church called Mars Hill, which was a church pastored by Mark Driscoll out in Seattle, Washington. Basically the intention of the podcast, at least their stated intent, and you can hear it in the opening monologue, I guess, that Mike Cosper, who's the host, does. You can hear their stated intent is basically to, I guess, tell this story of sadness and try to figure out how it all happened. How did this church rise to such prominence and then implode overnight, basically? And then their other stated intent is basically to show how God works even in spite of that. And so that's what they try to do. This podcast, as I just mentioned, is hosted by a rather well-known host named Mike Cosper. And the reason why this even came up was because there was kind of a spat online last week. This is at least the reason it came to my attention, between Megan Basham, who put out a post about some kind of sponsor that the Mars Hill podcast had. And then Mike Cosper got on there and they started going back and forth. So anyway, I didn't really get into that. I didn't really spend time even caring to know what that was about. I'm sure it is important, but that's not why we're here today. It reminded me once again to do a podcast about the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast. So here we are today. We are going to be responding to that. Okay, so a couple of things I want to talk about. First of all, I want to talk about Mark Driscoll. Mark Driscoll was the pastor of Mars Hill for a long time. As the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast states that Driscoll was allegedly one of 3 founders of this church, and he stayed there for a long time. He stayed there until he resigned. I think it was in 2014 that he resigned. And then now, present day, he's pastoring another church in Arizona. That's a topic for another day as well. We talked about actually some sermon or an attempt at a sermon that he gave at a men's conference, I believe it was. I think this was probably last year at this point. But yeah, he's still alive and kicking. That's for sure. He's seems to have plenty of gas in the tank still. At any rate, so let's talk about Mark Driscoll. So I'm going to be critical of Christianity Today on this episode. All right, I'll just put my cards on the table right here. They've said plenty of things about Mark Driscoll that I'm sure are very true. And so when I talk about the things that Christianity Today did wrong, do not take that as my approval of Mark Driscoll. Okay, I want to make that very clear because there were certain things that that as I listened to a decent amount of the Mars Hill podcast as I was preparing for this show. I had listened through the entire thing, I think all 12 episodes in the past, but I refreshed my memory by listening to most of it again leading up to this show. So yeah, there were several things that stuck out to me as just, that's not a good idea. Like there was a point where he was trying to update the bylaws of his church, and he basically fired 2 elders, which is kind of a weird terminology. Like, how do you fire elders? And it does get a little bit messy because I guess if I remember correctly, those 2 elders were on staff as well. But firing elders, or I guess removing elders, that's not something that you should do, really. Like if they just disagree with your bylaws, or with your proposed bylaws. So that would be one place where I was like, not a great idea. There was also, I think early on in one of the earlier episodes where Driscoll sat someone down and basically said, you're being accused of heresy, or you've been accused of heresy. And this person, if I remember correctly, was removed from her position, whatever position that was in the church. And from what I understand, neither one of those situations were situations where removing these people was called for. So like that would be a situation where like, yeah, I'm not a huge fan of that. Also, I can say without qualification that I'm not a fan of the language that Driscoll used in the pulpit. Okay. Now let me even qualify that, because I don't mean that I don't mean that I'm offended by the hard things that he said, because I think a lot of the hard things that he said were important, needed to be said. But the way in which he said them, and I don't even mean the tone of voice he used or the way that he delivered it or anything like that. I just mean the words that he used to deliver that message, often using, cuss words and things like that. I mean, not as much as some people say. Like, he earned this reputation as the cussing pastor, apparently, because of how much how much people say that he swore. But even the Christianity Today podcast acknowledged that Driscoll did not swear in actuality as much as people said that he did. But nevertheless, it's still there, and I don't like it. I would recommend, if anyone was asking me, hey, should I use this language in the pulpit? I would say, no, you shouldn't. And there are some things that are just off limits when you are in the pulpit. Words that you should not be saying. We'll leave it at that. So that's another thing I'm not a huge fan of. Also, I think there were a few reconfigurations to the way that the church was governed over the years. And see, I would tend to err on the side of caution, even on that, because you can't really say for sure whether or not something was the right idea as far as church governance is concerned, unless you were involved in the church, unless you were like on the elder board or on the diaconate, if there was such a thing, or one of the pastors or something like that, or one of the members of the church who was, involved and in good standing. I hesitate even to say what I'm about to say. Okay. However, I think that one thing that I picked up on them doing was they had elder rule at one point in their church. They were a big proponent of that. And then as time went on, it kind of seems as if that was taken away. So where there was no, church members voting on anything, and also the ability that the elders had even to vote against Driscoll if they wanted to, for example. I don't know if that was taken away completely. I mean, I think that if someone from Mars Hill or from that situation were to see this, they would probably say, no, there was a way. But it seemed like it was toned down. Their ability to vote Driscoll down if they wanted to was toned down. So that I was not a huge fan of either. And there were just a couple of places where he got into really explicit stuff that I would not say in the pulpit, things having to do with women, things that really should only be discussed in the company of a husband and wife, just not stuff that I would be comfortable saying if I was in the pulpit. I just don't think it's the right setting for that, especially when you're in mixed company in a church preaching from the pulpit. Not a good idea. All right, so I say that all up front just to remind you that when I talk about the things that I was not a fan of from Christianity Today, doing this podcast, when I tell you about the things on their end that I was not a fan of, I want you to know that this is not me saying just because I don't like the way that Christianity Today presented this or that. This is not me giving my support for Mark Driscoll or saying that, hey, I think Mark Driscoll's the best pastor in the world, because I don't, okay? So I want to make sure that that's clear, okay? With all that being said, Christianity Today's presentation of this issue, I believe, on the whole, was not an accurate representation. And the reason that I say that is there's a couple reasons why. One reason is because of the people that Cosper was constantly interviewing for this podcast. Now, there were some people that I thought, they seemed pretty unbiased and pretty objective, and that was nice. That was refreshing. I appreciate when people at least try their best to be objective about a situation, as much as they can. But there were people, on the other hand, who clearly had an axe to grind against conservative Christianity. Okay, you've got people like Joshua Harris, who's not even a Christian anymore, and it's not that he's not a Christian because of Mars Hill. Okay. Which I almost think that that's kind of the way that they were trying to present that because of Mars Hill and the trends that Mars Hill introduced, now, Josh Harris is not, and because he swam in that culture and whatever, and now he's not a Christian anymore. So look, this Mars Hill culture is making people not Christians. I almost think that that's kind of the way that it was presented as it related to Joshua Harris. Now, you could correct me, you can tell me I'm wrong, but that's what I perceived as I was listening to it. Another voice that I think clearly has an axe to grind against conservative Christianity is Rachel Denhollander. If you know her background, you know that Mars Hill is not the only church that she ever went after. And so that would be another person I would say seemed to have an axe to grind. There were a few church members who seemed to have an axe to grind against conservative Christianity. I give them a little more pass, though, because, if you were hurt in the church, then you're going to be emotional. You're going to be upset. You might even overcorrect to the other extreme. But there were people who were outside of this church and outside of this culture, really, like Joshua Harris and Rachel Denhollander. Like, why did you have to have these people on there? You bring on someone who's not a Christian and platform him and, basically give him the opportunity to speak into a matter of the church, really, right? And he's an apostate. Right? He used to be, as you may know, Joshua Harris, the author of I Kiss Dating Goodbye, apostatized several years ago now. And he was included on this podcast even after he committed apostasy. That was part of his introduction to the podcast. As Cosper was introducing him, he was like, hey, here's this guy who is now an apostate, and now we're going to hear what he has to say. What do you have to say, Joshua Harris? I just don't think that was necessary. Okay, if we want commentary on how a church should be run, why are we going to people who are not Christians, right? Rachel Denhollander, though, she doesn't, I don't think she professes to be not a Christian or anything like that. She has an axe to grind against conservative Christianity. And so, again, that's not an objective voice. And then there was another, I don't know if it was a group of pastors or one pastor. One of the pastors explicitly says was a female pastor in Seattle who was part of trying to arrange for a protest against Mars Hill and against Driscoll. And they presented this pastor just like they would present any other, I say pastor. Women can't be pastors. The Bible says that pretty clearly. But they presented this pastor just like any of the other ones. Like, hey, what do you have to say about this? And I get that there's an angle of it where it's like, okay, we got to do investigative journalism and we got to try to, get all sides of it. And I understand that. But if you're trying to be objective and objectively present what's going on, you can't stockpile all of these people who have an axe to grind against conservative Christianity, which I think pretty clearly as you listen to it, that was going on. And even Cosper's commentary ventured into being very critical of conservative Christianity. Now, I know Mike Cosper is going to say, if he ever sees this or ever sees anybody say, you're not a conservative Christian, Mike Cosper, he will say, well, I'm a conservative Christian. But the reality is he's not. Okay, I'm not saying that he doesn't claim to be a Christian. I'm not even doubting his profession of faith or anything like that. Okay, but what I'm saying is he's not conservative. He's not. And the past several years have only served to cement that reality. But even at the time, Cosper would get into spaces on this podcast where he was very critical of conservative Christianity. Specifically, they would often go back to these words like misogynistic. Misogynistic is a very difficult word to talk about because there are situations of real misogyny. We actually talked several podcasts ago now about Andrew Tate, right? Like that's an example of real misogyny. And when you pull out the word misogyny and slap it on everything you see that makes you feel a little bit upset, that basically reduces the effectiveness of the word when you actually need it. What I'm saying is if you look at every single thing that Driscoll says that makes you feel a little bit queasy and say, that's misogyny, that's misogyny, that's misogyny, then people are going to get tired of hearing that word. And when Andrew Tate comes along and it's actually misogyny and you say, that's misogyny, nobody's listening. Okay? And that's the problem. You can't wear out a term like that when it's really not a situation of that. Now, again, I'm not doubting that some of the things that Driscoll did kind of, they were not things that I would do. But when you use that term or terms like it, I mean, there were other terms that they used as well that were similar to that. When you use terms like that constantly, it wears out the effectiveness of them. All right. Another thing that was kind of interesting to me, and this is kind of a maybe an aside a little bit, but can somebody please explain to me the basketball episode? I mean, if you've listened to the Mars Hill podcast, you know what I'm talking about. They spent almost an entire episode talking about a basketball coach, and then at the end they kind of just tried to tie it into Driscoll's story, which I really think just from a stylistic perspective. I actually thought stylistically the podcast was really great. It was really well produced, and especially it was way ahead of its time as well. Like you might be able to point to other podcasts now that are as well produced as that, but probably not at the time. That was probably the best produced podcast of its time when it came out. And so, yeah, I mean, I give it an A+ on production, but one thing that I thought was maybe just a little bit of a tactical error or something was it's really hard when someone is clicking on a podcast expecting to hear a podcast about church, and they spend the entire episode pretty much, or maybe 75-85% of it talking about a basketball coach. And then at the end, they just kind of quickly tie it into Mark Driscoll, which I don't think they did effectively either. I don't know. Could somebody please explain to me, if you're watching and you've seen this Mars Hill podcast, can somebody please explain to me what is the significance of the basketball coach episode, and why did we spend like an entire 40 minutes of my time listening to an episode about a basketball coach? I don't get it. Now, the story was told very well, but I have no idea why it really significantly connects to the Driscoll story. So there's that. And as far as the interviews of the church members, I do want to talk about that. Some of the church members' testimony was sad in a way, because it sounded like they were just kind of looking back on this time in their lives that was good for a while, before ultimately the church imploded. But it's like a lot of them were just looking back on this time in their lives that was good, and they were kind of, glamorizing it. And there was even one guy who said, I have never really gotten to that point ever since then. I haven't ever been able to recapture that kind of experience, at a church or among other Christians. And that's really sad. That's really sad to hear. And I can sympathize with, I sympathize with you, man. I never went to Mars Hill. And thankfully I was never part of a church implosion like that. The Lord has blessed me in that way to this point in my life. But I do feel for you. I feel bad for those people who were in that situation, who, they're just kind of looking back on the past, wondering, can we get that back? However, I think that when people do that, they lose focus of the mission that's in front of them. And as hard as that is to say and to think about, there still is a mission in front of each and every person that that is a Christian and came out of that Mars Hill situation. And it's not to constantly live in the past and wish you had it back and glamorize it and have this feeling that you can never get that back, that you can never get to a point like that again in your life. As a matter of fact, when people are constantly looking back on the past and stuck in 20 years ago, they become ineffective in the moment. They become ineffective for the present. They lose sight of the most important historical event that took place in history, and that was 2,000 years ago when Christ died on the cross for our sins. Man, that is the thing. If we're going to look back on the past and think well of something in the past, that should be what we look back on. And you know what? That can inform our present. So when we're looking back on our past experiences and saying, man, I was so, I'm so offended by that person and I'm so upset by what they did, or man, I wish I had that time in my life back again. I don't know why God let me go through that, and I don't know why I'm here in this spot right now. All that does is it takes your eyes off Christ. And it's funny, I was just reading the passage in Hebrews 12 where it says in Hebrews 12 verses 1 and 2, it says, first of all, that we throw off these things, that these weights that weigh us down, right? We've got this great cloud of witnesses, it says, and then it says we throw off these weights. We throw off these weights that weigh us down. And then it says, what does it say after that? We look to Jesus. We look to him. We look to his example. We look to what he's done. And when we're looking around us and constantly, upset at people and, thinking about these things that happened in the past and not looking at Christ, then our eyes are not in the right place. Our focus is not in the right place. And so I have no problem with listening to a podcast to learn from the past and to learn from the errors that were made. That's really important. However, when it takes your eyes off Christ, like some of those poor church members, when you are so stuck in the past that you lose sight of Christ and you lose sight of the mission that he's placed in front of you today, man, that's tragic. All right. So as far as the podcast, I thought it was really well produced. I thought that they took a lot of the real issues that happened at Mars Hill and said, this is what conservative Christianity is like. And I think that was unfair. And I think that Christianity today should not have done that because it doesn't accurately represent what all of conservative Christianity is. All right? Well, that's my reaction. That's my response to the Mars Hill podcast. If you listen to it with a grain of salt, just knowing that there is some anti-conservative Christianity bias, I guess you could say, in there. Whether it's intentional or not, I don't know, but there you have it. All right? I hope you guys have a great week. We'll see you next time. God bless.